Have you ever just stopped and wondered, is authority actually real? Or, is it just this massive collective illusion? It's the kind of question that really challenges the very foundation of how we organize human society. Today, we're exploring a radical paradigm shift that completely upends practically everything most of us were taught about law, order, and obedience. We're looking at a deeply provocative thought experiment that asks us to imagine a world entirely without masters. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the highly disruptive voluntarist philosophy of Larken Rose, and we'll be primarily focusing on his foundational work, The Most Dangerous Superstition. Now, my goal here isn't to tell you what to believe, but to impartially guide you through this really fascinating, objective thought experiment. Rose's ideas are challenging, they're undeniably controversial, and they demand that we look very, very closely at the psychological mechanics of exactly why we obey. So if you're ready to test the boundaries of your own worldview, you are absolutely in the right place. Okay, let's dive into our intellectual roadmap for today. First, the superstition of authority. Second, the architecture of control. Third, the philosophy of liberty. And finally, the sovereignty matrix. Let's just jump right into Section 1, the superstition of authority. To really get this philosophy, we first have to understand that Larken Rose does not view the widespread belief in government authority as just some simple political preference. He doesn't see it as, a debate over taxation levels or zoning laws. Instead, he diagnoses it as a dangerous, highly irrational superstition, basically a mental parasite that's deeply infected the human psyche. To deconstruct this, we have to define our terms exactly as the source material does. In this framework, authority is defined strictly as the supposed moral right to command and the corresponding moral obligation to obey. Notice the word supposed in there. The entire philosophy hinges on the argument that this moral right is literally a mathematical and ethical impossibility. It's just a fabricated concept that we've collectively agreed to pretend is real. Now, what's really interesting here is the critical distinction we need to make between power and authority. Power is, it's just the physical ability to force someone to do something. A mugger in an alley, he is power. But authority, that is the perceived moral right to use that force and actually demand obedience. Rose argues that when a mugger robs you, you know for sure it's a crime. But when a government taxes you, society views it as totally legitimate. The physical act of taking your money is exactly the same, but the perception of the act changes entirely just because of this superstition of authority. Which brings us to this seriously devastating Socratic question directly from the source text. If an individual cannot rightfully rob their neighbor, how can they delegate that right to a group called government? Think about that logically for a second. You can't give someone a right that you yourself don't even possess. If you and I don't have the moral right to kick down our neighbor's door and demand their money, how do we magically grant that right to a third party simply by casting a vote? According to Roth, the entity we call government isn't a physical thing. It's literally just a collection of people, and those people cannot miraculously acquire rights that simply don't exist in the first place. And that brings us to Section 2, the architecture of control. So, if authority is indeed just an illusion, a mathematical impossibility even, then how on earth is it maintained? How do you keep billions of people actively participating in a system that objectively relies on their total submission? Well, the answer lies in deep psychological and societal conditioning. Rose illustrates this brilliantly with the metaphor of the magic hat. He points out that when a man puts on a magic hat, whether that's a fancy police uniform, a military helmet, or, a flowing judge's robe, people suddenly believe his actions are totally legal and virtuous. If a man in street clothes locks you in a cage, it's kidnapping. But if a man in a blue uniform with a shiny badge does it, we call it justice. The ritual of the uniform basically tricks the human brain into condoning acts that would otherwise be universally recognized as flat-out crimes. So we really have to ask ourselves, does a uniform truly change morality? Does a piece of paper called legislation actually provide a magical exemption from basic human ethics? The voluntarist philosophy insists that no, it absolutely does not. Morality is constant. If an action is wrong for you to do, it is wrong for anyone to do, completely regardless of their title, their job description, or the hat they happen to wear on their head. When people fail to realize this, belief in authority becomes what Rose calls the conscience killer. And honestly, this is probably the most dangerous aspect of the whole superstition. When you accept authority, you effectively outsource your own moral compass to a third party. You stop asking, is this right? And you start asking, is this legal? History is just filled with unspeakable horrors, wars, genocides, mass oppression, and they were committed not just by sociopaths, but by millions of otherwise perfectly good people who were simply following orders and doing what they were told was legal. This conscience-killing illusion, it's sustained from literally the moment we're born. It starts with the Prussian educational model, which, by the way, modern schooling is based on, and that was designed historically to train children to obey orders without questioning, literally just to create compliant soldiers and workers. Then it's reinforced by relentless social conditioning, where compliance wins you approval and disobedience brings severe social condemnation. It plays out exactly like that famous Milgram experiment, where people experience genuine, visceral fear at the mere thought of disobeying a perceived authority figure. And society masks all of this behind the logical fallacy of the consent of the governed, this idea of a social contract that literally no one ever actually signed. Moving right along to Section 3, the philosophy of liberty. So imagine we just completely tear down that entire architecture of control. What's left? Well, the absolute baseline of this alternative worldview is the concept of self-ownership. You own your life, period. To deny this is to imply that another person or some group of people somehow has a higher claim on your life than you do. As the source material powerfully states, humanity was never meant to be a domesticated species, managed like livestock by a ruling class. You are the sole sovereign over your own existence. Let's move to and see how this builds into practical reality. Because we all exist in time, right? So self-ownership manifests in 3 very distinct ways. Step 1 is your life, which represents your future. Step 2 is your liberty, which represents your present ability to actually choose. And step 3 is your property, which is basically the physical manifestation of your past time, energy, and labor. To lose your life is to lose your future. To lose your liberty is to lose your present. And to lose your property is to literally lose that portion of your past that produced it. And from these basic truths comes the absolute central pillar of voluntarism, the non-aggression principle, or NAP. It states simply that all human interactions must be strictly voluntary, and the initiation of force or fraud is always unjust. According to this framework, using force to take someone's life is murder, taking their liberty is slavery, and taking their property is theft. And crucially, this is key, it is the exact same moral violation whether it's done by one person acting completely alone or by a massive group of officials wearing fine hats and carrying badges. And finally, we arrive at Section 4, the sovereignty matrix. And this brilliantly illustrates what human society might theoretically look like if this whole belief in authority was just completely discarded and replaced by the non-aggression principle. Larken Rose's vision really contrasts the old paradigm with the new one. Under the superstition of authority, law is merely a command from a superior. But in the reality of sovereignty, it's a code of conduct agreed upon entirely voluntarily. Under the superstition, duty is basically just blindly obeying authority. In reality, duty is taking personal responsibility for your own actions. The myth defines crime as disobeying a government decree, but sovereignty defines crime strictly as initiating force against another person. And finally, order. The myth says order has to be imposed from the top down by force. Sovereignty argues that true, lasting orders arises from spontaneous, voluntary cooperation. Now, you might be wondering, if this reality is supposed to be so much better, why do people cling so desperately to the myth? Well, Rose compares humanity to an animal that's literally been raised its entire life inside a cage. If you finally open the door, the animal is absolutely terrified. It just doesn't know what's out there. It's essentially a massive societal manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. We have this deep psychological dependency on our captors and a profound, paralyzing fear of a world without a master to tell us what to do. So the crucial point here is this: mental sovereignty is the ultimate firewall against tyranny. The entire architecture of control relies 100% on your internal belief that the architects actually have a legitimate right to control you. The moment that belief is discarded, what we might call the sovereignty reset, the physical compliance just ends. Once you break that mental chain and fully realize no one has higher rights than you, well, the game is over. We've definitely covered a tremendous amount of philosophical ground today, challenging the very bedrock of modern societal structure. So I want to leave you with this final lingering thought to really chew on. If you were to honestly view the world through the lens of the non-aggression principle starting tomorrow, how much of your daily compliance is actually driven by your own genuine conscience, and how much is simply driven by the illusion of authority? It's a heavy question for sure, but one that is absolutely well worth asking. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.